In our context, immigration policy since the 1980s has become institutionalised, such that both major political parties largely agree on the fundamentals. And migration policy has changed a lot over those 4 decades. But although it's changed in a rather consistent fashion. And a lot of the big changes, like the point system I just mentioned at the end of the 1980s, were started under one government and then carried on over the other.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from academics in the Faculty of Arts and Education at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans toko ingoa. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts and Education, and I'm talking today to sociologist Professor Frances Collins, who's the head of school here in the School of Social Sciences, and whose expertise is in international migration, population change and urban transformation. Tēnā koe, Frances. Thanks for coming to talk to me.
Kia ora, Julianne. Nice to be here.
I want to focus today on your new book, because it's very exciting. It's just come out, published by Auckland University Press. It's called Edges of Empire, The Politics of Immigration in Aotearoa New Zealand, 1980 to 2020. And you wrote with your colleagues Alan Gamlin from the Australian National University and Neil Vallely from the University of Otago. So I like the title, Edges of Empire. I don't know why. It just feels romantic or something. Feels far away, and it just sparked my imagination. Why did you choose it?
Well, Julianne, this book here is about the politics of immigration, and it's mainly about the last 4 decades. But one of the really important things for us when we wrote the book was to situate the account we were given of contemporary migration, the politics, the policy making, all of that, in a longer history, and also to understand some of the key power relations that are involved in making immigration policy and governing the way in which people move across borders and settle in places. And so the title Edges of Empire does that, we think, in a couple of ways. Right, so Edges of Empire signals towards a kind of historical account of empire and being at the edge historically of empire. So quite clearly, Aotearoa New Zealand, in its current context, has been shaped by the British Empire, quite clearly through settler colonisation, the establishment of New Zealand as a dominion, and even post independence or full independence from the United Kingdom. We're in a way, historically at the edge of that empire. But at the same time, we're also entangled as a country in other imperial formations. So what came from the edge of empire of the British Empire was very much the emergence of another Anglosphere empire centred in the United States, which New Zealand is part of. We are involved in the Five Eyes security network, which, as it happens, has a Migration 5 sub-network that is quite influential in influencing migration policy, but also on tracking migration around those countries and indeed around the world. So there's an ongoingness to that empire that seemed to have finished. The other thing, though, is a kind of geographical element to empire and the fact that New Zealand has always been at the edge. And we can see that if we look right back to that earlier British imperial formation where New Zealand was not only the last of the settler colonies, the British settler colonies to really be established, but also it was at the far ends of the earth, or conceived to be at the far ends of the earth from that British imperial perspective. And that opens up possibilities for both, I guess, to think about empire, to think about how that's involved in our histories of migration and histories of migration policy making, but also to recognise there's, we're not at the centre or the core of empire, and that matters for migration as well. Because things, although we observe a lot of similarities in immigration in New Zealand to other countries, actually there are some really particular unique features here. Whether it's in relation to Māori and the significance of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or whether it's in relation to perhaps not having quite as sharp anti-migrant politics here as we see elsewhere. Not to say there aren't anti-migrant politics here. There are significant anti-migrant politics here, but perhaps not to the degree that we observe in some other places.
Yeah. we don't have a border with other people in the way that many other countries do we? I mean, we've got a whole lot of ocean around us, and so it's quite hard to get to us. It's not an easy task to be a migrant if you were coming from far away, for example, in earlier times. I guess that changes things a bit, does it?
It does. It does. Well, it changed New Zealand's relationship to British Empire, but it's significant today too.
Yeah.
Right? Because, in fact, New Zealand doesn't have a land border with any other country. Our borders seem common sense, but only because of the ways in which the islands that make up New Zealand are, have been collected together within a nation state. Yeah, that then we say these are natural borders, but of course they're not. No. They are borders that were established by the British colonisation of New Zealand. Māori had their own interpretations of space and territory and authority over space that were usurped by British colonisation. And so the borders we see today and the naturalness of that is a relatively contemporary phenomenon. But that isolation also allows for the state in New Zealand, ministers of immigration and the broader governmental apparatus to govern migration in ways that also aren't possible in some of the comparator locations. So in Europe, in North America even, where you've got contiguous land borders with, say, the US and Mexico, or even Australia, where it is actually possible to get to Australia by sea. Right? Yeah. Whereas it's really not conceivably possible to be travelling to New Zealand by sea, or not unless it's in a commercially organised way. Yeah.
So for the book, you spoke to 15 ministers of immigration. Is that right? I'm amazed they're all still alive.
Well, sadly to have passed away since we interviewed them.
Yeah.
We did. This is one
across
of the
both major parties.
Yes.
National and Labour.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was one of the amazing things about this book and the opportunity that comes with it. You think about speaking to former ministers of immigration or ministers of anything might actually, when you first hear it, say, "Oh, why don't we want to hear about these ministers and what they had to say?" And it might just be an account of self-congratulatory account of policy. But actually, that's not what we got out of this.
No.
What we got out of this was a really unique lens or approach to thinking about immigration policy making that centered both those individuals in the context they were in, but also connected that to a whole wider set of relationships they had, the way in which government operates, the connection between New Zealand government and governments in Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. And so their accounts, I think, just opened a new set of insights on issues that have been talked about in some other published research, but haven't been talked about in this way.
Going back to the 1980s, is that right?
Yes,
is that where beyond your initial account of the early stages of colonisation, you pretty much start the modern era there, do you?
Yes, we do, yeah. Because in the mid-1980s, you get this significant transformation in immigration policy in this country. Before that time, almost exclusively people who came to New Zealand had to be British or Irish, and in few decades in the late 20th century, Dutch as well, and a few other European origins.
Post-World War II,
Post-World War II, yeah. And yes, you had people coming from the Pacific, but under different conditions, in work visa arrangements or in the free mobility arrangements with the Cook Islands and Niue and Tokelau and such. So those were different sorts of situations. But actually in the 1980s, what we see is a transformation in immigration policy. Rather than being focused on race and exclusionary on the basis of race, migration gets reframed as in the terms that we describe as economic multiculturalism. That it's at once open, it's nominally, and I say nominally, less discriminatory in terms of race and at the border, in terms of who can arrive and whether they can stay.
And whether they're welcome.
And whether they're welcome. But in addition to that, those transformations also introduced a much stronger emphasis on economics as the fundamental basis of migration policy making and the purpose of migration policy.
As in people who could add to our economy, who came in with money themselves or with skills or both?
Both. Skills have probably been primarily the emphasis of immigration policy making. So, immigration policy pretty much since the 1980s, but especially since 1991, a lot of it's been about attempts to design the most ideal way of selecting migrants for settlement in this country. And once you start to talk to ministers about that, it's not just a kind of technical process of this plus this and we'll figure it out. It's actually a kind of process of experimentation, right? So there's the problem of, we want migration, but the argument is that we want high quality or well-skilled migrants. And then if that's the problem, then there's all these experiments in policy making that happen, right? Designing a points system, for example,
Yes.
that started in 1991, but then has changed ever since then.
Is that still a thing, the point system?
Still a thing, but it looks quite different now than it did
does it?
in
Yeah.
1991. And throughout those decades, it's changed quite a lot through this kind of experimentation, consolidation. Then there's a new problem that emerges, and ministers would pay attention to whatever that new problem was, experiment again, and of course we're not. And I should say that we're not. Although we have the accounts of ministers here, one of the things that we highlight is that although the Minister of Immigration is the executive authority over migration policy with their cabinet colleagues, actually most of the work we observe is actually undertaken by different people, by bureaucrats. Or in international organisations that influence policy making, or the influence of other countries on our policy choices around migration, all sorts of other things there. So we wouldn't say that the ministers are just the ones who design.
No.
But they certainly have an account that allows us to see into this complex process of putting policy together, the different influences that come in on it, what the rationalities were for migration policy, what the kind of technologies that were used and how they've evolved in terms of how migration might be governed. All of these things we can see by talking to those ministers. And they were free and frank in their commentary.
Who
with
were
us.
some of them? Just spark my memory.
Well. So what's interesting, I think, is that there are the ones who, if you know migration research, are well known to be the ministers. So people in this case, we'd think about Kerry Burke, who was also the Speaker of the House in the 1980s.
From the
Labour
Party?
Yes,
Yeah.
so he was part of the Longy government. We'd think of more recently Leanne Dalziel, for example, who was in Labour as well. We'd think about Michael Woodhouse and Ian Lees-Galloway. So Michael Woodhouse from National, Ian Lees-Galloway from Labour. But there are also some surprises in there, right? People who we don't often remember as being Minister of Immigration. And
because they had the job for such a short time? Or?
Because they did, but they
Yeah.
also are known for other things. So the
Okay.
one that stands out for me is Roger Douglas,
Oh.
right?
And for those who don't know,
And for those who don't know,
Yes.
Roger Douglas was the Minister of Finance in the 1984 Labour government, a government that radically transformed New Zealand society and economy by introducing a whole raft of neoliberal policies that really undid what made up the state in New Zealand. Undid the welfare state.
and set the direction of travel after that, really, didn't
Absolutely
it?
did.
Yeah.
It absolutely radical in broad sense. But we don't often associate that directly with migration policy until much later. And I think what's interesting then is you get somebody like Roger Douglas, famous or infamous, I'd probably say, for his work as Minister of Finance.
Yeah, quite unpopular with many people.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Who actually is Minister of Immigration for a short period of time and very influential when he was in it.
And what did he do?
Well, so the earlier ministers before him in Labour had introduced the Immigration Act 1987 that had removed the nationality discrimination criteria. So basically it did the multiculturalism bit. But it didn't introduce any new technologies for how migration might be governed. Who's going to get selected? Under what criteria?
And from where?
From where? For what purpose? So Douglas is in the role only for about 9-10 months, okay? And it was his way back into cabinet. But what he did, though, is he did a very classic thing for him. He's again, he's infamous. People have different positions on his politics and policies, but I think most people would agree he's a thinker. And so he got his hands on migration policy, which he had no interest in previously, and said, what's the problem here? The problem is we need to think about how we select individuals to come into the country, and we need to think about how that's done and what kind of outcomes will come from that. And he goes on this trip. He talked about going on this trip to Australia, meeting the Minister of Immigration from Australia and senior bureaucrats over there, going with New Zealand bureaucrats. And what we see that follows in the months after that is the start of the design of the points system, which is usually associated with the National Party that came after them. But actually, it was in Roger Douglas's interview that he told us about this, and we initially were like, that's not actually what happened, because we're always so familiar with this being an introduction from the National Party. But actually, we went and fact-checked it, and absolutely, if you look at the parliamentary record and some of the press releases back from that time, they were talking about it and designing it before the election.
It was his idea.
It was, his idea in collaboration with bureaucrats, which was then taken on by Bill Birch, who took over as Minister of Immigration following that. So it's just one story, but it's a story that kind of, there are all sorts of these little stories that pop up when you talk to the ministers and the sorts of things they grappled with at the time they did it, the kind of politics that's there. And I should say a lot of the continuation of policy on immigration between governments. Right?
Which has been quite steady and stable in a way, has it?
Yeah, which is surprising, right? We start out the book by saying that migration is apparently this area that's deeply politicized, and it is.
It certainly is overseas,
and it certainly is here too, I would argue.
Yeah.
But curiously enough, in our context, and maybe this would have similarities if we looked elsewhere too, but let's just speak about Aotearoa New Zealand. In our context, immigration policy since the 1980s has become institutionalized, such that both major political parties largely agree on the fundamentals. And migration policy has changed a lot over those 4 decades. But although it's changed in a rather consistent fashion. And a lot of the big changes, like the point system I just mentioned at the end of the 1980s, were started under one government and then carried on over the other. So we can say the same thing, for example, the 2009 Immigration Act, which introduced a whole raft of new sort of risk and security measures into immigration policy and also enhanced the power of the minister. That was initiated by David Cunliffe and Clayton Cosgrove under Labor and was continued on as a bill and put into legislation by Jonathan Coleman as Minister of Immigration, in that early years of the Key government.
Which is the national government, yeah.
Which is national government.
Yeah.
Same thing is true when you look at the late 2010s, the shift towards temporary labour migration that occurred primarily in the Key government with Michael Woodhouse in power as the Minister of Immigration. Although Labor, when they campaigned in the 2017 election, said, we need to think more about exploitation and we need to think about levels of migration. When they came into power, they continued the same settings, and in fact enhanced them in many, many ways. And again, even although this is after our book, the current settings that we have now are largely introduced under the last Labor government. This national government criticised them at the time. But they keep them pretty much. But they keep them largely as they are, right? And this is a pattern. This is a kind of institutionalization of those settings across time.
Can you just explain to me, because I don't entirely know, because I've never tried to get into this country as a migrant before, what the point system does and who it favours and who we currently tend to welcome in this country, today and in times past as well, in the last 20 or 30 years? Yeah,
so overall we'd describe the point system as a way of measuring, it would be described by policymakers as a way of measuring human capital, right? So the claims about the value that different people have because of their education, their age, right, being of working age, for example, their work experience, the occupation they're in or an occupation they might well be offered, other things around health and police checks and things might broadly fall into that area as well. But it's basically focused on education, your capacity to work, your capacity to deliver skills.
And you get points out of something.
Yes, you do. So in the original scheme, you got a certain amount of points for having a bachelor's degree and a certain amount of points for being a certain age, certain amount of points for your language ability, all of these sorts of things that were part of the mix of what goes into the points system. It's changed a lot, so I wouldn't try to go through and describe all of those changes. But what I would say is this, is that while it appears to be, or is claimed to be non-discriminatory, right, it actually is fundamentally discriminatory. It must be because it's based on selection. So at a minimum, it's discriminatory in class terms because it favours people who have higher education, right? But actually, if you unpack it a bit and you look at what it takes to get a qualification recognised, what languages are obviously preferred, in this case, English, and various other things, we realise that there's a lot of nationality selection criteria that are still indirectly there in the points system. So if
It's just that we're not directly saying that.
we're not. So if you have let's say you're a nurse. Nurse is a good example here, actually, I think. If you're a nurse from the United Kingdom, being trained in the United Kingdom, then your nursing qualification is automatically recognised here by the Nursing Council. You do have to still sit a IELTS test, an English test, to reach over a particular level, but you've already got a recognised qualification, and your language is going to be there to get that, and your chances of getting a job are relatively good given the way the recruitment processes work here. If, on the other hand, you're a nurse from the Philippines, your qualification and your work experience is not necessarily recognised here, even potentially if you've worked in other countries outside the Philippines.
Even if you have good English?
Even if you have good English, right? And so it's not to say they couldn't go through a process to be recognised and then go through the skilled point system, but it would be much longer and burdensome, right? And so that's where we see that indirect role of nationality-based discrimination still maintains through that system. The other thing I'd say is that the point system is only one element of what's happened with migration. So the point system is all about people being able to come and stay in New Zealand and live here long term.
But the temporary visa is the other thing, isn't it?
That is the other thing. And actually, over the period we've looked at here, that's the other big change in migration policy in this country. A shift from migration policy that was primarily about people arriving, being given residence, and being able to live here long term, and having rights to family and various other sorts of things, towards having some of that, but actually overwhelmingly having very large numbers of people granted different sorts of work visas with different sorts of rights, depending on the job they were in, depending on the income they earned, sometimes even depending on the region in the country that they were working in, with quite a lot of controls on what they can and can't do in their daily lives, and even controls on rights in the labour market, the right to change employer and things like that.
They have to stay with the same employer some at times and things like that.
Well, they have additional burdens. So, if you have a work visa, for most categories of work visa, they are linked to an employer. So if it was me, I'd be linked to the University of Auckland, but also required to work in Auckland and required to work only in an academic job. If I'm on a work visa and I want to change employers, I need to actually inform Immigration New Zealand that I'm going to do that before I actually change employers. So I can't just go and get another job. So this puts people in very precarious positions, of course, because it's much harder to change jobs when you've got an extra set of steps to do there. And of course, your job is reliant on your employer maintaining your status.
Yes.
So you don't really want to risk upsetting your current employer, because that may lead to the end of your status as a work visa holder in the country. So that's been a huge change in immigration policy, that we now have hundreds of thousands of people
from all over the place. For example, from.
Well, if we look at work visas, the top countries are the Philippines, China, India, not necessarily in that order, but those countries consistently are the highest, make up the most of our work visa, people on work visas here. But what's interesting, I think, if you look at the different sorts of work visas, so if you look at those that are deemed higher skilled, which tend to have better rights associated with them, they're longer term, family can come with them, those sorts of things. There's a much wider range of nationalities. So you'll see quite a few people from the UK there, the US, Canada, other Western European countries, and yes, people from China, India, Philippines, and other places too. But if you look at the lower skilled work visas, almost everyone is from those three countries that will make up a huge amount, but then others will be people from the Pacific and other parts of Asia and South America. And almost no one from Western Europe and North America will be on those lower skilled work visas, which are short term, have limited access to health and other sorts of social supports, and can't have your family with you.
There have been quite a few issues, I think, in recent years that have exposed that some of those conditions for people who are, for example, working in agriculture, picking fruit, doing those kinds of jobs, for a certain amount of time every year, that they're not actually necessarily being very well treated, and that, in fact, they're being exploited. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who's followed the news media in this country for the last 10 years would note that there's been a substantial increase in the reporting of workplace exploitation that migrants face on different sorts of schemes. That is a feature of the migration context here now that just didn't exist even 20 years ago, let alone in the 1990s. And that is because migration policy changed. And it's because we created work visa settings that disadvantage people on those work visas. So worth making a comparison, I think, to the 1990s, right? So we've already got economic multiculturalism, and we've got an increase in the number of people coming to New Zealand. But basically everyone is receiving residence visas before they arrive.
Right.
What does that mean? That means they arrive, they can go and look for a job.
They've got certainty,
with
haven't they?
anyone, right? They can work for anyone. And they have access to health, their family's probably with them, they've got a community connections, all of those sorts of things. Now, I'm not saying there weren't problems there. There were, because people weren't getting jobs at all in some cases and had long-term rights to stay, and that there were differences in expectations, there was discrimination in the labour market, all sorts of things. But in relation to kind of exploitation, that wasn't as apparent at all in the 1990s. Fast forward to the 2010s and even to now, and the large proportion of people coming in on work visas where, as you know, we were sort of talking before, people are tied to an employer, they have less rights than their fellow workers who are citizens or residents, it's harder to move employers, but also the migration system itself has become sort of driven by incentives, right? And what I mean by that is that many people who come on work visas have an eye to not just being on that work visa, but potentially being on another one, potentially gaining residence eventually. To do that, they need to maintain good relations with their employer. They also need to find a pathway to probably a higher skilled occupation, because that's what's going to get you residence. Now, again, this kind of creates this investment in migration. And migration policies encourage that. And it's created a kind of investment in migration that people make, that then they're more vulnerable also to exploitation that happens.
Because they're afraid to upset their employer, I guess, and ask for their rights.
And they may well have paid significant amounts of money to get the job, whether that's legal within the system or not. They might have paid for the visa. They might have paid an immigration advisor perfectly legally to do lots of work for them, but that's cost money. So there's all this personal and financial investment in migration that happens. And I would argue, and in many ways we argue in this book, that that's not just a neutral occurrence. That is an outcome of the policy settings that we have. And policy settings that, curiously enough, start to look much, much more like the things that we see in other parts of the world, for example, Southeast Asia, Singapore, or the Middle East, where large numbers of temporary workers are subject to workplace exploitation, often indebted, and have no long-term rights to stay or become part of society. That's not something that's often said here about our migration policy, but actually there's lots of what our migration policy does today that looks like that. Yeah? And when we talk to the ministers of immigration, just to circle back to that, the latter ones, so mainly here I'm thinking Michael Woodhouse and Ian Lees-Galloway, they certainly saw those settings as the only way things could be. Right? They didn't,
because we needed those workers and that's how we were going to get them, kind of thing?
Yeah. So it was a kind of what I'd probably describe as an ideology of temporary labour migration where, as you said, there was perceived to be a need for labour, and that's always debatable too. The perceived to be a need, right? I'm not necessarily questioning it, but the idea that there's a shortage in the labour market has to be produced as an idea first before it's acted on, right? And that's actually quite a complicated thing to measure in itself. So there's a perceived need, but then there's the other side of the argument that says, well, but we can't actually allow all of these people to stay. We can't actually give them all rights. And the claim there is that if we did that, then we'd be back at square one with having labour shortages again. But those two claims, when they work next to each other, sustain the situation where people on work visas have fewer rights than everyone else. And that's the ideology that sits there and has become the normative ideology. In fact, normative ideology in this country. And post the period we looked at, post COVID-19, arguably that situation is intensified.
What about the future? Do you have any ideas about how things are going to go in the next 10 years, for example? Could you make a prediction?
I think it's very hard to make predictions about immigration and immigration policy making. I would say one thing from what we argued here, and then I'd say another thing, I guess, is an observation beyond that. So the one thing about what we argued here is as I said earlier, immigration policy making in this country has become highly institutionalized, such that we don't see a lot of change when we have changes of government. So just because there was a change of government, let's say next year in 2026, I don't believe that that would lead to any substantive change in the fundamentals of immigration policy making. I do think there's an opportunity, however, and it's an opportunity that was there in the time where we were really writing this book, and that is the opportunity to rethink immigration policy in relation to the specificity of this country, and in particular in relation to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So in the period when we were writing things up, the New Zealand Productivity Commission completed their inquiry into immigration, and one of the findings they gave, which I completely agree with and reflects the scholarship of many significant Māori intellectuals like Tahu Kukutai and others, is that since the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Māori have basically not been involved in decisions about immigration at all, despite that document being arguably New Zealand's first immigration policy document. So I would say there's an opportunity there to actually rethink migration by starting from a point of what does this look like from a Te Tiriti perspective. Now that doesn't predetermine what the outcomes of that are for immigration policy, but it's a starting point to actually rethink rather than keep that institutionalized perspective. Of course, in the current government, we've lost all emphasis on Te Tiriti, sadly, and that's something we need to push back on, and maybe there'll be opportunities for that in the future. But I really don't know in relation to the international environment. We see, the situation with Trump in the US, really, really authoritarian modes of rule, in particular in relation to migrants.
And in Europe as well, and
in
the
Europe,
UK.
You look at the UK and these protests outside, places where asylum seekers are literally just sheltering, and these, racist, white supremacist sort of, protests taking place there and being defended by politicians in wider context in Europe as well.
So we have got a pretty fraught situation internationally to deal with, haven't we?
Mm. And in migration, the politics of migration are very much at the centre of that in many ways, or at least it's used by authoritarian and populist rulers as a kind of as a tool in their rhetorical strategies and their attempts to gain support is this kind of claim that migrants are taking over and such that's quite common in those contexts.
So if we can avoid that would be very good.
It would. And our own example of that here has been less virulent. I suppose Winston Peters stands out, and he comes up in the book a number of times. Never Minister of Immigration. I don't think he'd want to be. But certainly someone who's shaped politics around migration in this country, at least through the influence he's had in elections and things like that. But perhaps not to the degree. We haven't seen to the degree that we see for example, of a Trump or a Nigel Farage in the UK or the European populists.
Long may it continue.
Indeed.
Our tolerance. Thank you very much, Francis, and I really look forward to hearing how your book goes. I think it will go very well. It's very interesting, and it's very much of its time. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Julianne.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts and Education by following us on social media.